Hi, my name is Yasmin Terehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness and spirituality. Today's episode is with Jeffrey Mishlove, PhD. Jeffrey is the New Thinking Aloud host and the author of The Roots of Consciousness, Psi Development Systems, and the PK Man. He is also the recipient of the only doctoral diploma in parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited university, which was at the University of California, Berkeley in 1980. And between 1986 and 2002, he hosted and co-produced the original Thinking Aloud public television series. He's also the past president of the Intuition Network. This man is a legend in the world of consciousness, and when I interviewed a few of my previous guests on Gateways to Awakening, a number of them mentioned his name time and time again. And when I went down the New Thinking Aloud rabbit hole, I was surprised to see who he had interviewed, from Ram Dass and Terrance McKenna, to name a few, and also the way he interviewed his guests, often diving into a diverse set of topics in a deep and thoughtful way. I also recently purchased his book, Roots of Consciousness, and was so impressed with the volume of work. So for those of you who want a comprehensive guide of almost every type of modality, check it out. And so, Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, Jeffrey, this was a hard kind of interview for me to prepare for, because you have interviewed so many different type of people in the world of consciousness. But I wanted to first start off and talk about some of the major themes that may have emerged over the years in the world of psychic phenomenon to start. And perhaps what has stuck out to you from all the interviews and subjects that you've discussed. I know that's a loaded question, but I wanted to just kick it off there and see what was most memorable to you in your tenure.
Well, when I started in this field almost half a century ago, it was a very exciting time. It was the 1970s, and we were just learning about the research in remote viewing being done at SRI International with Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann, and it was an open secret that the government was involved and the CIA was involved. And it appeared as if we were about to turn the corner and everything was going to change. In fact, one of the people I have interviewed over the years, Jacques Vallée, a computer scientist, a UFO specialist, who was working on the development of the internet. At that time, in the early 70s, the internet hadn't even been created. It was just underway as a project by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And Vallée thought to himself, the internet has the possibility of dramatically changing the world, and so does parapsychology. They could both be revolutionary. And now we can look back and we can see that the internet was indeed revolutionary. Everything is different today as a result of the internet. Everything, certainly in modern Western countries, is different. And parapsychology has yet to achieve that potential, but it's there. It's just happening at a slower level. I can look back now over 50 years and see that there's been very, very slow, steady progress. And in some ways, you might say we know only a little bit more than people knew 100 years ago, but it is more. There is additional knowledge. There are new approaches. There's widespread communication amongst many different communities that are interested in this work. So I think over the long run, parapsychology will have as dramatic an impact on our culture as the internet has had, but it will take longer. It could be another, I don't know, perhaps even another 100 years.
Wow. So what happened with some of the government studies, and, why has the momentum for the field of parapsychology not achieved the speed of growth that the internet has achieved. You mentioned that there's been obviously some evolution, but definitely not the rapid rate of evolution that the internet has had. So I'm just curious, what has happened first with those government studies, if you can recall, and then also why has the momentum stalled?
Well, I don't want to say the momentum has stalled. I think that the 70s was a particularly exciting time, and we were young and naive. But back in the late 19th century, William James, the founder of American psychology, who was deeply involved in what was then called psychical research, which is a discipline that is really, for all practical purposes, identical to parapsychology, just a different name. He said, this field, we cannot expect it to advance decade by decade as other disciplines do. Rather, we have to look by the century and by the half century. And the reason for that is because the findings of parapsychology and psychical research have to do with the metaphysical foundations of reality. And we live in a culture metaphysically that is pretty much wedded to materialism. That, in other words, solid matter, or atoms, you could say, and particles are at the basis of all reality. Everything can be reduced down to quarks or photons or protons and electrons. And uh, the findings of parapsychology point in a very different direction. They say, no, consciousness itself is primary. Matter is derivative from consciousness. So that is such a huge metaphysical shift that, and there's so much resistance to people thinking that way, because pretty much everybody who gets a college education is indoctrinated into thinking about the world like it's a big clock, some kind of a mechanism, a giant machine of some sort. And even people are machines rather than spirits. So it's going to take a long time to overcome the emotional attachment that people have to the materialistic worldview.
Do you think that this materialistic worldview and this kind of over-indexing towards the materialistic worldview has a lot to do with kind of the shift from the kind of orthodoxy that we've had towards religion, right? As people have kind of become less religious in the last century, have you seen that, or is that not really what you've seen going forward?
Well, society itself is like a big cauldron that's bubbling, and all sorts of changes are taking place. And it does seem to be the case, especially in the last 10, 20 years, that interest in religion is declining. At the same time, interest in what some people think of as the religion of no religion, that is, secular spirituality, is on the increase. So I would say, from a sociological perspective, there has been a big shift. The fastest growing group in society today, I think, are probably people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious.
Right. Yes. So I want to go back to a point that you made about some of the studies on psychic research. Are there any studies that stick out to you in particular that have really helped you form your opinion on this subject? We did have the Institute of Noetic Sciences on the show, and we talked about some of their research, but I think, for the mainstream perspective, it seems like that question keeps coming up over and over again. Where is the research? Where's the peer-reviewed research, and how can I get access to it? And it definitely exists, but I don't think that there's a really great central repository where folks can just easily find this information. And I'm just curious, since you've spent so much time in this field, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are lots of good popular books that are out at this point, but for people who are listeners of your podcast who have a professional interest in the scientific literature, I would point them toward an article that appeared in August of 2018, as I recall, in the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. It was written by Etzel Cardania, who back then was the editor of the Journal of Parapsychology. And it summarizes all the evidence in parapsychology. It's sort of an overview of something like 1,400 different published experiments with enormous statistical significance and many different styles of research, but all getting the same result, which, from a scientific point of view, would be falsifying the null hypothesis that psychic phenomena does not exist. In other words, they're getting positive data. And it could be psychokinesis or mind over matter. It could be precognition, looking at the future. It could be clairvoyance or remote viewing or influencing quantum mechanical random event generators. I think really the best way to approach this is to have an overview of the field, because at this point, with scientific research going on in the field since 1882, when the Society for Psychical Research was founded in England, there's an enormous body of research that's available. And to me, Yasmin, the great shame is that after 40 years, I'm still the only person, at least in the United States, with a doctoral diploma in parapsychology. There should be college and university programs and even high school programs all across this country and other countries studying this vast amount of data. It's very important. It's paradigm shattering data, and it affects each and every one of us. And the sad thing is that when people go into denial and treat this data as if it never existed, which is the standard way it's approached in orthodox scientific and academic establishments, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because this data is important information relating to the nature of consciousness and the self. In other words, there's a big gap in our own self-knowledge because this data is in effect suppressed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's been definitely my experience kind of sitting in the business world, and then also learning a lot about the world of parapsychology. And it just feels like like you said, there's just a wall that comes up every time any words are mentioned. And, it's just super interesting just to see the level of discomfort with this space. And, and I think it's just probably not a popular cultural subject, and because it's something that we don't understand. And I think humans are probably very scared of the things that we can't categorize and rationalize and index in our intellectual minds. But even so, it's sort of been fascinating how much of a resistance there is from a mainstream perspective to this work. Jeffrey, I'd love to talk a little bit about whether you have knowledge of the government continuing this kind of research on remote viewing, or anything in the parapsychology space. Like, do you have any evidence of the government continuing this type of research? And if they have not continued, do you know why?
Well, I don't have any direct information. All I can tell you is that it would be very smart of the government if they were continuing, and also given the controversies that have occurred in the past, it would also be smart of the government, if they are doing it, to keep it very quiet and not to engender a lot of publicity around it. So if the government is engaged in this research, it's maybe a good thing that I don't know about it.
Right, exactly. They're doing their job. Jeffrey, in the book Roots of Consciousness, which it's mind-blowing. When I received it, I was just flabbergasted by how you were able to put this together. You start off, though, by saying that there are many studies on the flowers of consciousness, like what blooms out of consciousness, but not enough written about the roots of consciousness. And can you tell us, like, what, in your perspective, are some of the guiding principles of these roots of consciousness?
Yeah, the fundamental principle is the one that I think is common to the mystical traditions of virtually every culture around the world. And I could sum it up. You probably heard the joke about the Dalai Lama is at a baseball game, and the hot dog vendor comes along to sell him a hot dog, and he says, "Make me one with everything."
I have
And
not heard that.
yeah,
That's very
yeah. The
good.
basic message is that everything is interconnected. It's all one. You see, parapsychologists like J.B. Rhine coined the term extrasensory perception to define what we call ESP, meaning clairvoyance, telepathy, and precognition. And the thinking was that there's some sort of an information channel like mental radio, that there's some kind of magnetic or electromagnetic or quantum waves, and that's how people perceive this information. But in fact, after decades of research, there's no evidence of any channel of information to explain psychic functioning. There's no evidence of any organ of information reception in the human organism. And so, how does it occur? Well, I think the mystery is solved when you realize that we partake of everything. It's very basic to quantum physics. It's known as entanglement, and it's simply the case that the idea that you and I are completely separate from each other. Of course, we were born apart from each other. We will die apart from each other. We have our own personal life histories that are very different from each other, except now while we're conversing on your podcast. But actually, at a deeper level, we're connected. You might even say we are one at a very deep level. The philosopher Schopenhauer referred to the one consciousness that sees through the eyes of every living creature. And so for me, that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. That's been a recurring theme among all my guests as well, is this like concept that we're all interconnected and that we're not this like separate, part. We're all kind of part of this whole. And I think that our approach to life is very different when we think that way versus when we think it's a zero-sum game reality that I think so much of mainstream culture has perpetuated. So, wow. So Jeffrey, I want to talk about some of the concepts in the book. We're so focused on modernism, and mainstream culture has forgotten most of indigenous wisdom. And so I think indigenous wisdom has definitely become more popular. I've seen sort of anecdotally in the last 10 years or so. And I'm, wondering, like, what does the role of the shaman tell us about how indigenous cultures perceive their worldview, and how were indigenous cultures also able to gather so much knowledge for so long? Like, I think that there's something there that most people just are not aware of.
Well, it's certainly the case, and you have to appreciate that we've come out of a colonial era. In the 19th century, the European powers dominated. England ruled India, and Belgium had a huge stake in Africa. And Spain and Portugal dominated the Latin American countries, and Native Americans were basically subjected to colonial rule in the United States. Indigenous people everywhere were treated as if they were less than fully human. They were called savages, for example, and we looked down on them. And so when the first anthropologists encountered shamans, they thought of them as being akin to schizophrenics. Basically, they thought of shamanism as a form of mental illness that somehow was socially sanctioned in these primitive cultures. Now we understand that how wrong they were, that shamans have cultivated a deep knowledge of plants. For example, let's look at the use of ayahuasca in the jungles of the Amazon. And if you talk to the shamans who work with ayahuasca or the shamans who work with peyote and ask them, well, how did your people come to learn about this? They'll tell you that, well, the plants talk to us. We learn from them that nature is alive, that the spirits speak to us. It is a completely different worldview from thinking of the world as a cold, dead, mechanistic clock of some kind. To the shamans, everything is alive. Everything has soul and spirit. Everything can communicate with us. So these are the two worldviews that are essentially at odds with each other right now. People who pride themselves on modernism feel very proud, and in many ways, of course, they're justified in feeling proud at having overthrown superstitious thinking. I think we can all agree that superstitions can be harmful and dangerous for people, but an animistic worldview in which we accept that the universe itself is alive doesn't necessarily have to lead to superstition. It can be quite compatible with modern science. And I would say that there are people today who are taking a deep interest in shamanism and combining it with scientific thinking. There's nothing unscientific whatsoever about adopting what you could call an idealistic metaphysics.
Right. Right. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, your interview list, which includes so many incredible people over the years. And, it's just interesting because I've never actually interviewed someone who's also been, frankly, like the most prolific host in the world of consciousness. And so I'm wondering, what was the most memorable interview that you've had and why?
Well, there are different interviews that have stood out in my mind. Usually, Yasmin, the best interview is always the one I'm doing at any given moment. And because it's very important when you're doing an interview to be present in the here and now. And everybody is in touch with a place within themselves where wisdom comes forth. And so my job as an interviewer and your job is to bring that out of whoever we're interviewing. I can say that there are some people who have influenced me more than others. Jean Houston is one, wonderful psychologist who I've known for half a century. Other people who have been mentors and teachers to me have been people like Charlie Tart, Arthur M. Young. One of the most powerful interviews I think I ever did was with Rollo May, a person with whom I don't particularly have a lot of agreement. He's for your listeners who may not know, he's considered an existential psychotherapist. He's the author of a best-selling book called Love and Will, and a person who in his personal life, to the best of my understanding, worked through a lot of deep depression to come to a more profound understanding of the human condition. And I found that in interviewing him, and it's happened on a few other occasions, people just bring me to tears. They open up so much and expose their own depths. Sometimes it's just tears of joy, actually, kind of feeling of enormous sadness and enormous joy at the same time.
Wow. Wow, Jeffrey, I love that you brought up Rollo May. I read one of his books, not the one you mentioned. I can't remember the name of it now, but I actually had used one of his quotes in a couple of my presentations. I think it was something like, I'm gonna, it's not the exact quote, but something like, if you're going in the wrong direction, people often tend to run faster, which is what we should not be doing, right? We should slow down and take a moment and disconnect to reconnect. And so, yeah, I just love that you mentioned him, and I also appreciate your philosophy on being very present with whoever you are with and bringing out kind of the piece of them that people can't really find online, right? It's what is it about this person that, and their message really, that we want to share with the world. So, I guess, in terms of why you decided to pursue this career in parapsychology and why you've dedicated, 50 plus years of your life to this subject, like what is why did you decide to do this? And has that changed from thinking aloud to new thinking aloud?
Well, New Thinking Aloud is really a continuation of the original Thinking Aloud series. It got reborn after a hiatus of over a decade. Originally, I was like a lot of people who came of age in the 1960s and early 70s. I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin and had a conventional undergraduate education in psychology. I got a psychology degree, but young people at the time were already experimenting with psychedelic drugs and experiencing mystical states of consciousness. So even then, I had a strong interest in mysticism, but I pursued my academic career by going into criminology. I was a criminology student at Berkeley. I was working as a volunteer in the psychiatric unit at San Quentin Prison doing group therapy with murderers and rapists. And it was obviously very intense. It was very rewarding. At the same time, I felt very, very strongly that I wanted to focus on the positive forms of human deviance rather than the negative. It was easy to study crime and psychopathology at a place like Berkeley, a great university. It was much harder to study creativity, intuition, mysticism, and psychic functioning. It was practically impossible. And I agonized over this for months and months. Finally, I had a dream. And the interesting thing is, I knew before even going to bed on a particular day that I was going to have a dream that was going to answer this riddle that I was struggling with. How do I reorient my career? And I did. I had this dream. I was visiting some friends at an apartment in Berkeley, California, in married student housing. Got there, knocked on the door. Nobody answered. And in the dream, I knew where they kept their key. I found the key, let myself into their apartment, walked into the living room, and there on the middle of the living room floor, face down, was a magazine spread open. And I picked it up in my dream, and as I was paging through it, I woke up with this feeling of like, eureka, I have found it, the motto of California, incidentally. And at that point, I knew I had the answer, but I didn't know what the answer was. So I acted out the dream. I put on my tennis shoes. I ran 5 miles across Berkeley to this particular apartment, knocked on the door. And as I had dreamt, no one was home. And in fact, these were my close friends. I knew where they kept the key under the doormat. So I let myself into their apartment. And there in the middle of the living room floor was a magazine. as I had dreamt. In my dream, the magazine was called EYE. And in actuality, it was called Focus. And for your listeners who are in the San Francisco Bay Area, they may know Focus still, to my knowledge, the magazine of listener-sponsored radio and television, KQED, in San Francisco. And as I was paging through this magazine, it dawned on me for the very first time in my life that I could pursue my interests by getting involved in listener-sponsored media. So I went over to KPFA in Berkeley, which is a Pacifica listener-sponsored radio station where I live. And I said, I'm here to volunteer. And even though at that point I had my master's degree in criminology, they said, well, sit at this desk, and when you hear the buzzer sound, push this button to let people in the front door, which I gladly did. And within 3 weeks, I had learned how to produce radio programs, and I produced one about how you don't have to be from out of town to be psychic. And the program director liked it so much, they said, well, we have a slot every Tuesday and Thursday at noon. There's a program called The Mind's Ear, and we'd like you to host it. And so all of a sudden, within a few weeks of my dream, I found myself sitting across a table from world-class experts in all the areas that interested me the most, and 10,000 people listening in on the radio to our conversation. Wow. That's what gave me the confidence to go back to the university and taking advantage of a program they had to set up your own unique individual doctoral major, to create a doctoral program just for myself in parapsychology. So that's how it happened.
Wow, that's incredible. I love that story so much. And I actually resonate so much with, dream premonition because I also had led a more conventional life and also had a massive dream that shook me up, and basically, had heard the words, remember what you came here for, as I was waking up, which just opened up, a can of worms of what I was here to do. So I love that this dream was so vivid and so profound, and how, I guess like the path of least resistance showed up for you, right? That it was just so easy. And I think that feels, in alignment with my experience of being on the path. Like things just are a lot easier when they're flowing. So I want to talk about, first of all, are there any other... Oh, go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, let me just comment on what you just said, Yasmin, because I want to be clear about this. I think it's important. It wasn't necessarily easy. In fact, it's very difficult being in parapsychology. But even the process of generating that dream, as I mentioned, I agonized for months how I was going to shift out of criminology to study higher forms of consciousness. I really did. And I think that process of really focusing intensely and wanting this with an enormous intensity was part of the process. There's something known in psychology as Jacobsonian relaxation, where you tense every muscle, you tense your feet, your hands, your arms, your legs, all of your muscles, and then you can relax. And then things are easy. But it's not just easy all the way. It's first focus, focus, focus. It can be quite stressful, and then relax.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then how after you had that experience and after you were able to get that degree, did things become easier? I mean, did you still have moments of big transitions within this journey where you felt like you had to shift, or has it kind of been more of a linear path?
I would not call it a linear path. I've had many diversions along the way. While I was in graduate school, the closer I got to getting my doctoral degree, the more obstacles were put in my way. Finally, after enormous struggle the completion of my dissertation, I got the degree, and then the so-called skeptics, who are not really skeptics at all. I think the best description of them came from my friend Stanley Krippner, who calls them scoffers. But they launched a concerted effort to get the university to revoke my doctoral diploma after it had been granted. And I ended up being libeled and fought a libel suit for 6 years. So after being libeled, I was virtually unemployable. So it's been a very what can I call it? A journey that seemed to wander all over the place. Along the way, I got licensed in clinical psychology. I learned computer programming. I set up a business in law enforcement. I became a real estate broker and a commodities trading advisor. So, I benefited a great deal from the fact that I became unemployable in academia and basically had to take an entrepreneurial attitude towards my life and my career.
Wow.
I can look back now at the age of 74 and say overall it was wonderful. It worked out beautifully, but there were many stressful moments along the way.
Wow. And what kind of kept you resilient while you faced all these obstacles? Like what was it about you that just wanted to keep going and staying on the course of this work, really?
Well, it's hard to say. I guess I just had this sort of fundamental instinct towards a mystical worldview and tended to pursue it every opportunity that came along. But when it didn't, there were many times when, I did what seemed to be necessary to support myself.
Wow.
So I learned computer programming, or I learned how to sell things, or I learned how to produce television programs.
That's incredible. Wow. And what was your family's perception of you choosing this path? Because I think that's also a question that comes up for kind of the sort of rebels of their time. Like would you have a supportive family, or did you have a supportive network of friends, or did you feel like it was kind of a solitary journey?
Well, looking back over many decades, there were times, for example, when I was libeled, when my friends in the parapsychology community, and they're loving people. I have many, many friends in the parapsychology community, but when I was just libeled, almost all of them wanted to have nothing to do with me. I was an embarrassment to them because, who takes the time when somebody has been publicly attacked in the media, and in my case, in a Psychology Today magazine, who takes the time to research it? Most people assume if you read an article in a magazine that says this person is a terrible person, well, maybe it's true. And so I had to struggle with that for many, many years. And I fought a libel suit. And at the end of the day, after 6 years of battling in the legal domain, I finally got a favorable settlement and cleared my name. But it was difficult sledding for quite a while.
Wow. That's amazing. I mean, I love hearing your story of strength. To me, you're definitely a hero for being able to go through that and not give up. So that's incredible. And Jeffrey, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done, either through your own research or other people's research, about our experience in this galaxy? Because I think that's such an interesting topic. And there's been, a lot of controversy over the last year with what's actually happening in outer space. And, I'm just curious, like what sort of the themes that have emerged from that work? And I apologize, I know that this is a non sequitur, but I wanted to make sure that we spoke about this topic because it's something that's been highly requested from folks.
Well, one of the projects I worked on while I was a graduate student and thereafter was studying a man who claimed to be half human and half alien. His name was Ted Owens, and he called himself the PK man because he said that aliens had operated on his brain and given him extraordinary psychic abilities, and he could demonstrate these powers over and over and over again. And I knew that he had done some remarkable things. He had impressed my friends Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ at SRI International by claiming that he could end a drought that was taking place in California back in February of 1976. And he ended another drought, apparently, in London later on that summer. And so I studied him for 10 years. And he claimed that he could produce UFO sightings at will. And I worked with him. To set up a study, a controlled experiment. He said he would create 3 dramatic UFO sightings in the San Francisco Bay Area within a 90-day period. And I set up a study where we used the San Diego area as a control. And we had some dramatic sightings. And then he called me up one day and he said, Jeffrey, I can feel this. It's going to be really, really big. There's going to be a UFO sighting within 100 miles of San Francisco. It's going to be seen by hundreds of people. It's going to be photographed. And the photograph is going to appear on the front page of one of your local newspapers. Well, that happened just a few days later and more. It was not only photographed, it was videotaped. And the videotape was broadcast on the Channel 9 Evening News in San Francisco. So that really impressed me with the fact that when we talk about communication with alien beings, it's not just little green men from Mars. It could be hyperdimensional entities who have a deep knowledge of psychic functioning and are able to do things at the psychic level and even at the material level that are well beyond the most advanced capabilities of scientists here on Earth today. We are part of a galactic community, but we're not yet ready to join that community, especially because our self-knowledge is so limited. We have to begin to understand, for example, the whole question of consciousness and its role regarding survival after death. If you look at the UFO literature carefully and the life after death literature carefully, you'll see that there are some very significant overlaps where going back into the 19th century, seances in the spiritualist community where alien entities show up in seances. So we're not going to be ready to join the galactic community until we have a greater self-knowledge and a greater knowledge of consciousness and its role as understood in the fields of psychical research and parapsychology.
Wow. That's incredible. I want to go down the rabbit hole of reading the PK Man, and also, is Ted Owens still alive or did he pass?
He died in 1987.
Wow. I was going to say, we would probably need his help with a lot of climate change issues right now going on all over the world.
Well, it's very hard during his lifetime to interest scientists and to work with the government to use his abilities for the benefit of humanity. But for the most part, he was the sort of person who, when he said, I can do this and I can do that, people would call him a madman or a fool or a liar. And he would then say to them, well, I guess I have to teach you a lesson. And things often became unpleasant when that happened.
Oh, wow. So fascinating. So was when he said he would do something, was it right? Did it actually happen? What, like 80% of the time or 100% of the time? Like, was there, I mean, even the fact that these things could happen, like UFO sightings, is so, incredible, right? But I'm just curious.
Well, I have in my files data on 168 demonstrations that he produced in which he sent letters out in advance to scientists saying, I'm going to use my powers to do this or to do that. And usually large scale phenomenon, ending droughts, influencing hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, power blackouts, things of that sort. And I would say roughly 2/3 of them worked out the way he said they would. And my simple estimate is that for the most part, these events had less than a 1% chance of occurring by chance alone. So statistically, it's only a very rough estimate that I could provide, but it would be overwhelmingly significant.
Wow. Fascinating. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to reading that book. So Jeffrey, I feel like I could talk to you all day. This is so fascinating, but I know we're coming close to time, and I just wanted to ask last few questions. In terms of this last year, with the pandemic, and us, slowly emerging out of the pandemic, kind of going back in, right? We're sort of coming out of it. What have you, perceived in terms of like the future of humanity and in the future of consciousness? Like, has anything shifted your perception about how humanity will, evolve in the world of consciousness in this last year? It could be anecdotal, right? Because I'm not sure that, folks have had the chance to even run studies at this point, but I'm just curious, like, how has the pandemic changed your worldview, and what have you sort of seen in terms of how it's changed the worldview of others?
Well, nobody has asked me that question so far, and it's a little outside of my domain of expertise. I would say that humanity is facing an enormous challenge at this moment in history. We're dealing with multiple problems. We have political problems, just getting along with each other in this country. The two parties are practically at war with each other right now over the abortion issue, over the issue of election fraud. Which, as far as I'm concerned, does not exist, but one political party is maintaining that it does exist in the absence of evidence. We are polluting the planet. We're facing serious problems related to climate change caused by human behavior. We make war. We've just concluded a war in which something like $1 trillion has been spent, much of it going, one wonders, what did it go for? Forms of corruption. So I'm aware of the enormous potential that humanity has to join, as we've discussed earlier, the galactic community. At the same time, especially because of my background in criminology, I'm aware of the dark side of human consciousness and human behavior. And my concern, Yasmin, is that as a civilization, we don't do enough to honestly look at our own dark side. And that may be the undoing of humanity on this planet. It's not clear to me that human civilization will survive. I hope it does. I think human civilization is wonderful, and it has a great deal to offer to to the universe. But uh, we're kind of right on the edge right now, and we seem to be quite capable of destroying ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, it's terrifying. Especially folks who are operating in this zero-sum game reality, winner take all. And I'm wondering, Jeffrey, what do you think, based on all the conversations you've had with folks, and if you have, an opinion, what do you think happens after we physically leave the body?
From all accounts of the near-death experience, the reports that come back from these people seem to suggest that they're experiencing the early stages of the afterlife. As far as I'm concerned, the afterlife is very real. It's probably quite describable in terms of hyperspace mathematics. Just as I think we can probably describe the activity of UFOs and alien intelligences much the same way. I think there's a big overlap there. It does seem to me that the afterlife can be a very positive and loving place where opportunities for spiritual growth continue for people. On the other hand, there's a dark side there as well. There are classical descriptions by Milton and Dante going back hundreds of years. I think that I don't take those descriptions at face value. They're literary descriptions, but I do think we can take the reports from near-death experiencers and from young children who experience past lives, and those same young children often describe what we call the intermission state in between lives. So we can begin to create maps of what the afterlife is really like. There are people who also explore it through meditation, through the use of psychedelic drugs, through other forms of mental discipline, such as self-hypnosis or lucid dreaming. I think we're on the cusp of an era in which, just as 500 years ago, explorers came from Europe to map the new world, we can begin to map these areas of consciousness that the Tibetan Buddhists have called the Bardo plains, where the afterlife exists. And we can think of those as continents of the mind. It's very important, I think, that we do this, because until we're familiar with these continents of consciousness, we're not going to be equipped to really enter into full partnership with members of the galactic community who seem to be knocking on our door, if you accept all of these reports that are now coming out of the government.
Wow, that's so profound. I mean, I'm sort of, I'm with you because I so desperately want to at least offer a gateway, right? This is called Gateways to Awakening, a gateway for folks to explore some of these concepts and to do their own due diligence, essentially, and to have their own journey. And, I'm wondering, like, what advice can we give people to inspire them to want to make that journey, right? I think that I just see there's laziness is not the right word. Maybe it's like the collective hypnosis. I don't know what it is, but it seems like it's difficult to persuade people to invest time, and I'm talking about the mainstream, but to invest time in this quest of who we are, where we come from, why we're here, and to just be open, right? I think that's the thing that's been so difficult from what I've seen. And I'm just wondering, like, do you have any advice for folks?
Well, I think we live in an exciting era in the sense that we are now the recipients of the wisdom of every culture around the planet. Their knowledge is available on the internet. It's available on YouTube. I've created well over 1,000 videos for people with all sorts of detailed information about the realms of parapsychology and transpersonal psychology and dozens of self-help approaches and psychotherapeutic approaches and meditative approaches. So this wisdom is available now at a level that is unprecedented in human history. All I can tell people is that the quest for self-knowledge, which is the ancient philosophical quest that Socrates enjoined people to engage in. I think you will read, I don't know if it's Socrates, but the unexamined life is not a life worth living. Nothing is more rewarding than the quest for self-knowledge, and the possibilities available for people who embark on that quest today are greater than they ever have been.
Amen. Wow. I love that. And Jeffrey, lastly, I just wanted to ask, what sort of things have maybe surprised you the most in this last 50 years of doing this work?
Well, when that UFO picture appeared on the front pages of the Berkeley Gazette 3 days after Ted Owens said he was going to make it happen, that was probably the single biggest surprise of my parapsychology career.
I can imagine. Wow. I'm going to go look that video up as soon as this is over. Fascinating. And Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time. You are just such an inspiration, and I'm just so in awe of what you've accomplished and what you've made accessible to people in your lifetime. I mean, what a gift. And are there any resources that you can point folks to in order to learn more about you, where they can find your books and where they can find access to Thinking Aloud and New Thinking Aloud?
Well, you can simply go to New Thinking Aloud, all one word, and aloud is ALLOWED.com. And that'll take you to the YouTube channel.
Amazing. Great. And we'll leave the links to the book and the show in our show notes. So thank you so much for your time, Jeffrey. This was so lovely.
It's a pleasure, Yasmin.
Thank you. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about the roots of consciousness and the search for answers to the beyond with Jeffrey Mishlove. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again.